Good morning. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the Spring Forum. Some are saying that the connectivity that the internet enables is not only making the world smaller, but making it worse. We worry about fake news, surveillance, the invasion of our privacy, the exploitation of app-based workers, and the proliferation of propaganda on social media, to name just a few. The belief that the internet is broken has become a new common sense. If the internet is broken, it's urgent that we fix it. But how? Sheila Warren is the Chief Executive Officer of Project Liberty Institute and the Chief Strategy and Operations Officer of Project Liberty. Previously, she served as the inaugural CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation, the premier global alliance advancing responsible crypto innovation worldwide. She founded the Blockchain and Digital Assets team at the World Economic Forum, and as the deputy global head of the forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, she oversaw a strategy across 16 countries to advance the adoption of new technologies in the global public interest. She has dedicated her career to ensuring new technologies are built equitably and ethically. Today, we're going to be talking about reimagining an internet that is designed for people and the collective good. Sheila, I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Last time we were together, we were just having tea in my office, and it was it was so good. You helped me to understand these new technologies that I really needed to have a better grasp of, and you were so helpful in that meeting. I can see us in my mind's eye sitting there with the tea set in the front table.
Well, it was a joy and a pleasure to have someone with such insatiable curiosity asking such good questions.
Oh, well, thanks. I really appreciate it. It's definitely something I'm very interested in. You know, Chris Dixon wrote this book called Read, Write, Own, and it's about the evolution of the internet. The read section of the internet was when it was really an open platform. It was from 1990 to 1995, and was more about us reading it as almost like a newspaper, reading like bulletins. The second phase of the internet in 2.0 is, writing Facebook posts, putting pictures up, putting sermons up. And the third, that's the second. And he said that in that second phase of the internet, it really became dominated by just a small handful of companies that really control everything that happens. And he said that the third phase could be a new phase that's built on blockchain technology, which kind of re-empowers people to really own their own material on the internet. And I wonder if you can just talk about that like little typology, just how helpful it is, how much it makes sense, and whether it really is possible to change the internet when so much control is vested among so few people already.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. And I do think that this framing is an accurate depiction of what has happened and what I believe is happening in real time right now. So maybe I'll tell you a bit about my own experience of the internet.
That'd be great.
That might be a way to think about this, because I'm not actually a technologist by training. I'm a lawyer by training.
Yes.
And so but I was somebody who grew up, I was a kid in like the late 80s and early 90s. And at that time, we were playing online games, right, Nintendo, things like this, but it was very static consumption of content. It really mirrored your television set. So you might be playing a game, but you were playing with a person sitting next to you in real life, right? There wasn't a way to engage with another person really online. That started to evolve in the mid-90s. I was the first class in college at Harvard where every freshman got an email address. I remember teaching seniors only a few years ahead of me, a couple years ahead of me, what email was, how to use it, and learning myself in real time.
You just brought back such memories for being in the computer center in the basement there.
That's right.
Because I didn't have a computer, and in order to do anything, I spent hours and hours in that basement.
That's right. In the computer lab. But the computer lab concept is not something we really have today because you have your device in your pocket, in your mobile. So that evolution happened really fast. And you think about the time scale of human existence, very, very, very fast. So we talk a lot about this Web 2 era that you mentioned, this kind of concept we think of as digital nativity. So we talk a lot about, children are digital native these days. They grew up with a device in their pocket, or they grew up with this concept that you could publish something and have a massive audience of people that you don't know. And I think that's part of the key. So what that opened is very compelling in some ways. It gave people who felt isolated, for example, a way to reach across a border and have an amazing conversation with someone. I remember, again, just speaking about communications. When I was growing up as a kid, you had to wait for long distance rates to come down to call. Like my parents grew up in India, to call India. We waited till 8 o'clock at night. We're waiting for the phone lines. Now you could just send somebody a text and they'll get it in their time zone, but it's pretty instantaneous communication, right? So your world expanded in many ways. And for a while, that was really great. Now, I think in Chris's book, he talks about this as well. You're seeing, we've kind of that sort of bell curve, we've kind of peaked on that. And now the problem is the barrage of information you're constantly getting, and the fact that what you're being served up when you open up your browser, when you open up your social media, whatever it is, what you're getting served up may not necessarily be something you have any control over, right? Because your data is being used without your knowledge, in some cases without really your explicit consent, to create this content farm. And that is owned by a handful of monopolistic companies that are really serving to extract that data and sell it to advertisers and others. That's problematic.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I was, that image of all the heads of the major tech companies at the inauguration. I mean, that was such a vivid image, I think, for so many people. It made me wonder, what you were thinking when you first saw that image. It was a. I don't know if it was intended, but it was definitely a wake-up call, I think, to a lot of people.
Well, I'm pretty sure it was intended. I mean, I don't think anything's unintentional about that. I think everyone's aware of the cameras at all times, right? Certainly, if you're in that world, I think you're quite aware of what you're showing up somewhere and being present means and doesn't mean. So there were some deliberate choices being made there. And it's interesting, right? Because you could imagine even 20 years ago, wouldn't have been the tech companies up there. It would have been, I don't know, maybe the media companies, perhaps, right? Maybe the editors of newspapers, like that. It would have that kind of impact. Because again, the other thing we know, people are consuming their content online. They aren't necessarily going to, forget print versus online. They're not even looking at online media companies for content. They're getting it from TikTok, from Facebook, from Instagram, from all these different places, and it may or may not be accurate. Right? So that's a huge thing as well. So to get to that third phase again, what I think Chris calls the own era, I call crypto nativity. And it isn't necessarily meaning that you're trading cryptocurrency. That's like the most narrow way of thinking about it. It's this idea that we really should be part of that economic model. We should have more, we call it voice, choice, and stake at Project Liberty, literally have more voice, more choice, more ability to move throughout this online ecosystem in ways that we're determining ourselves, not that are being kind of shoveled up in front of our faces at all times. And our options are deal with it or just leave altogether, which has its own consequences.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot about, I had a little conversation with Rebecca Nessel earlier this morning before you arrived, and she was saying, I need people to explain the Bitcoin idea or the blockchain idea to me. And she said, I'm not sure when I'm going to get it. I'm like, I'm sure you're going to understand it soon. But maybe you can talk a little bit about like what blockchain technology is. Just maybe you can explain what it is and then why it's important for us to have just kind of an inkling of what it is, at least as an ordinary person.
Yeah, for sure. So this is something I've been doing for a long time. It never gets easy, right? Well, let me tell you again a personal story about how I became interested in the blockchain, because I think this helps people orient to it, because what hits you in the news is, Bitcoin's trading at this number or Trump coin or whatever it is. And this is about a lot more than that. So let's get to fundamentals. So I was general counsel of an SF-based company called TechSoup, a nonprofit. And we were doing a lot of work in the developing world and a lot of work with activists. And we were seeing a lot of hacking attempts on our servers, okay, and a lot of concern around this. If this data were leaked, it would result in people's lives being at stake, being in jeopardy. So I was having dinner with a friend of mine, and I said, we've done the encryption we can afford, right? Encryption is like you get to pay premium pay. We can't afford that. What are we going to do? And he said, have you thought about putting the data on a blockchain? And I said, what on earth is a blockchain? And he said, have you heard of Bitcoin? And I said, well, yes, that's what people are using to buy illegal things on the internet.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And he said, well, yes, but the technology underlying it is actually really interesting. Yeah. So I became very, very enamored of the technology very quickly, because I realized it could actually solve my problem in the ways that we've been talking about to date. So what a blockchain is essentially a recorded ledger.
Yeah, distributed
ledger technologies, okay? And some of these are open source. They're completely open the way the internet is. Some of these are closed. They exist within a company. But it's a way of creating an accounting system, not financial accounting, but information accounting that is immutable, which means you cannot change it, okay? So let's think about examples where this might be relevant. You and I know each other. Yeah. So if you were to say to me, hey, I'm going to give you some information, and it came from so-and-so source, I would trust you because we know each other. But if you were someone I didn't know, I might be like, well, how do I know that it came from that source? I'm not sure. A blockchain will record the transmission of that information from place to place to place to place to place. And without getting into too technical of a detailed load, because of the way a blockchain is organized, nobody can change that record. Yeah. So you can look back and you can see this information originated with somebody on the ground in a country in strife. They recorded this bit of information. It went to this news agency. It went to online, to whatever, Facebook or whatever, and then it came to you can see all that.
Yeah.
So we call it the truth machine or the trust machine, because you don't have to trust the parties that are looking at the ledger, because all of you are seeing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And you know that for sure. Now, this might have been less interesting in Web 1, right? Now, with all of the signal, all the noisiness that we have, all the chaos we have online, verification of truth, of origin, is really important. So it's one example of what a blockchain can do that you could, in theory, you could just keep a spreadsheet, right? But how do you know that what went into that spreadsheet wasn't altered by somebody? And even if you can see an editing function, someone didn't mess with that, right? This makes all that impossible.
Yeah, and it's really those two technologies. It's the distributed part of it, that it's on all these different machines, and then also the encryption part of it, which means that I'm not worried that I was being impersonated by somebody who made all these machines.
It's tamper-proof.
Yeah.
Right? Is really the way to think about it, which in this day and age is a pretty important characteristic of information.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's so interesting. I just think so much about what how it might change the internet. Maybe you can talk a little bit about like what you don't like about the internet and what this might mean for us, like your dreams for it for the future. Maybe your fears and your dreams.
Well, I love that question. I think about this. Like, what's the utopian scenario? The dystopian scenario, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think we're kind of living the dystopian scenario right now, I would say in many ways, not to be too apocalyptic about it, but I do think that we're in a world right now where what we see online is controlled by not even a full handful, like really 4 companies are controlling everything we see. Because people don't think about this, right? But when you could leave a social media app, but you're still in a browser instance, you're still using email, you're still online in some meaningful way, and what you're doing is being tracked. So people have this eeriness and kind of sense of creepy surveillance, because we talk about something. If I were to say, I don't know, name of a country, probably when I get back to my phone, if my phone were in vicinity, I'd probably get served up an ad about that. It's weird, right?
Yeah, we're talking about garage door openers. And I'm like, I haven't talked about garage door openers in 15 years. And all of a sudden we have that conversation. There's on my phone.
There it is, right? That's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
And so people, I think, gloss over it because it is so uncanny and eerie. But that's because there's such an amalgamation of information about us held by this handful of companies. And they can serve us up whatever they want to serve us up whenever they want, right? So it's I'm very uncomfortable with that personally. And the idea that it's not democratic. I didn't vote for these individuals. I didn't have any say in their anointing to this kind of power, and I'm not.
Yeah, in fact, I kind of objected to it. I didn't like Google buying YouTube. I didn't like Facebook buying Instagram, but no one really asked me my opinion about it.
It just happened, right? We don't have any control over these things, right? So let alone WhatsApp at the time,
right?
Oh
my gosh, WhatsApp.
So it's interesting that you talk about this, right? Because there was a big effort to say, well, the issue is an antitrust one. The issue is just competition. Well, yes and no, because you could safely make the argument. I think I would have made the argument as a lawyer back when Facebook bought WhatsApp that they were very different things. Facebook was online, social, whatever. This was a chat texting app, right? And at the time that was examined by people who know what they're doing, and they were like, oh, that seems fine. But over time, the amount of information you get, someone's chatting over here, and they're watching something over here, and they're talking to their friends over here, and all of that collective, wow, that's a lot of information. So that, I think, leads to the dystopian outcomes. Now, thus far, we have seen these companies, I think, as benign dictators of sorts. That seems to be changing. Okay, we now are seeing, I think just the fact that XAI bought X, well, I don't know how we feel about that. The fact that...
I didn't really understand that.
Well, I think it's just making obvious what was already happening, which is those companies were owned by the same individual. There was nothing stopping all the information that was on Elon's Twitter, as I call it on Twitter, now X. Nothing was stopping that from them from sharing that with other places and training an AI, right, to then interact with you in ways that are going to be very manipulative, potentially, very emotionally manipulative. Based on you, very, very calibrated to you personally, right? Not to a generic you or a statistical you, to literally you, okay? Right. So that was already happening, but now it's just like, well, we can pull the curtain back and just acknowledge that's what we're doing anyway, right? So I think that kind of consolidation is going to become more and more common, and the reality is these companies, because of the data that they have and possess, that they rightfully own according to the law, right? They do own that information. They can train AI in a way that others can't. They either have to go buy the data, and then we haven't even gotten into the issues around training an AI, which are energy consumption, data centers, like forget all of that, just the sheer amount of data alone, right? So that's all very bleak. But my hope, and what I'm working on at Project Liberty and the Institute, is we're trying to say, what if we broke all of that and we said, I control my data. I have full decision-making authority over what happens with my information and where I put it. Now, I might choose to stay on one of these platforms with full knowledge that, okay, they're surveilling me, they're manipulating me, whatever. But you know what? I get more out of it than not, and that's a choice I can make. Now, is that a real choice psychologically? That's for psychologists and sociologists to weigh in on. They would say no, and I would agree with that. But leaving that aside, right now, there is no choice. If I were somebody who made my living on TikTok, for example, or on Instagram, if I wanted to move, now in some cases, you've hit such a level of celebrity, right, that if you moved and you said, now I'm over on this other place, people would come with you, right? And we've seen this with journalists and Substack and Medium and whatnot. It happens on occasion. In most cases, massive attrition, right? People don't follow you, or they follow you, but they can't find you, or something is off or odd, and people's attention is so short, right, that they'll just go. So if that's your livelihood, and that's where you make your income, your following.
I have friends who are like in the religious sector who worked so hard to get a huge Twitter following, and now
they don't want to be there. They don't really have a choice.
So
I know. It's difficult.
And they can't just move.
It's very difficult, right? So what if instead you had a model where you owned your social graph, so all of that information, with the consent of the other people, could come with you? Right? So you could say, anyone I follow, if they leave, I want to know and I want to go automatically. That could be something you decide. And you could just port all of that somewhere else that might have better rules, it might be more fair, it might be owned by someone whose politics you support, whatever reason. It's impossible right now, but that should be possible. But you can't do that unless the base layer, speaking in technology terms, the very base layer of the internet is fixed. Okay, to your point about being broken, to your opener. Unless that is changed, we are not a user-centric internet, we are a platform-centric internet. All of the benefit goes to platforms. Not because the tech was necessarily built that way with that design in mind, but at this point, the capitalist structure we live in makes those models the stickiest. And to compete in that environment is basically impossible, as people have seen time and time again who've tried to, right? So making that different, and the thing I think is we've tried in the Web3 space, as we call it, people have tried to build these new apps. Okay, they've tried to see will people come. That's, again, very difficult. Starting organically is tough. What we're saying is actually, it's almost like the dining table with the tablecloth. If you pull the tablecloth out, everything could stay, right? And you could actually change out that base layer of architecture, and you could make things more user-centric. And we've done this with a couple of, I call them fandoms, a couple million users. We've shown that if you change the base layer of the stack, you make the technology user-centric. Every user is a single unit that holds their own data. There's no collective data pool. They're all held by those individuals. Things are sticky. Things work. I've even wondered if, like, the Episcopal Church could just start its own social media platform that was like this, and because a lot of the communications I have are between. It's not like social media for me is only to communicate with other people in the church, but it would be like a large community of people where you might start this. And the advantage of that too is that I'm not connected to a lot of those people I want to be connected to, because some people like Blue Sky and some people like Twitter and some people like Facebook, and so that is a sign that I see of hope. Let's talk a little bit about so this blockchain technology, it has implications in all different sectors. We've been just talking about like what effect it has on the internet. Could you talk a little bit about what effect it has in journalism and in terms of what kind of how do we know about our world? So right now, content's a big question. I think I mentioned this a little bit in terms of how do you verify that something is legitimate? And certainly with the advent of AI, where, these things are, I think most of us can kind of tell, it's an AI photo versus, especially the babies are really creepy. Like, that's not really a real photo, that's AI generated. But they're getting better and better and better. And very soon you will not be able to tell the difference. And if it's something that you don't have context for already, you like at certain kinds of animals or whatnot that you haven't seen before, like, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know the difference, right? And we saw this with the photoshopping is kind of a funny thing. Like, people laugh about the odd Photoshop hands or arms. That's all going to get fixed pretty quickly. And you won't have that uncanny valley sense of something is off. So we're entering that world, and we're not talking years away. We're talking probably months away from this being something that's really prevalent and persistent. So what do you do? Well, part of this is that tracking I mentioned, that traceability on a blockchain, that this was started here, it was stamped by this person. Stamped is not a technical term, but let's just imagine it, right? Then it moved here, and you saw it was here. So you can verify that came from the original source. And that can all be public. So there will be some training that happens for people who care, okay, to say, look, we can do analytics on a blockchain. We can show when a thing moved from place to place to place, and we can trace it all the way back to its origin. And I expect you're already seeing this in the financial sector. You're seeing companies that can trace, they call it wallet tracing, they can trace like where this flow of funds went. They do that to either stop terrorist activity, frankly, or to prove there was not terrorist activity, or both ways. With data and information, it will happen the same way. So you'll have a number of accountants, right, essentially, who are going in and doing this analytics. Because most of us don't have this time, and we just want a third party to tell us. But there'll be these trusted third parties that are generated.
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways, what I need is like an editor.
I think that's right, exactly. Someone that you can trust and who has done this enough times and is being cross-checked by others doing this, right? So you create essentially a pool of trusted advisors, let's call it that, that can tell you, and they can prove it. If you ever wanted to question it, they could prove it and show you exactly what they're seeing. So I think it'll become more and more important to understand these images and where they come from, or the content. Forget images, it could also be content. Did so-and-so journalist really write that? Right? And they're saying, no, I didn't, no, I didn't. Okay, fine, but can they prove they did or didn't? Or they're saying, I did write that and it was plagiarized, or all those kinds of things. One thing we talk a lot is copyright. Like, how is copyright going to be protected in this environment? It's very difficult. The Ghibli, Studio Ghibli, like those images right now, I mean, I'm not a copyright lawyer, and I haven't looked into it that deeply, but that doesn't seem right to most people. They're like, can you just do that? You can take Miyazaki feel and images and just make over every picture like that? That just feels intuitively wrong, right? So did they get permission to do that? You know, how to get that? It just happened. I don't think there was permission granted, to my knowledge. So things like that are going to become more and more common. And I think right now, Studio Ghibli is a trusted source to say, well, we didn't do that, but what if they did? Right? Then how would they prove that those ones are theirs, the other ones are not theirs, right? All of that gets complicated very, very fast, and blockchains can help.
Yeah. Well, I also think, I mean, so there's the financial world, which I haven't talked about intentionally because I just didn't want us to get too wrapped up in Bitcoin conversations. But maybe you can talk a little bit about like what this means for trade, for finance. I know you're somebody who cares deeply about just making low-cost transactions. So being able to transfer funds overseas has been something that's been an important part of your career. But can you talk a little bit about just where we're going on that, and how fast are we going to see changes in terms of how we actually use money, and how banks change and other financial institutions?
Yeah, well, interesting things that we're seeing banks adopt blockchain and adopt cryptocurrencies as opposed to fighting it. And they were doing this all along because what a blockchain enables is a ton of efficiency, right? So the origin story of blockchains is Bitcoin. Bitcoin was the first big kind of killer app, if you will, to use technical parlance, that exists on a blockchain. And Bitcoin is, it's money. It can function as money, depending on how you define which definition of money you're using. But it can be used for payments, it can be used as currency, all those things, a store of value, an investment, all those kinds of things. But the idea was, right now, okay, let's say, so if you and I went out to brunch, and I said, oh, I forgot my wallet, I'm gonna give you some money. And you came back and said, oh, you never paid me, right? How would we record that? Well, in most cases, we take out our phones, and I would Venmo, Zelle, Square Cash, whatever right? The reason that we'd walk away and forget all about it. The reason that we trust that transaction is because my bank is talking to our payment app intermediary, is talking to your bank, and there's a record, and we trust those intermediaries. We say, okay, I believe that my bank is accurately, taking $30 out of my wallet and giving it over through this, payment interface to you, and we're fine with that because we trust the banks. What if you didn't trust your bank? And this is true in a lot of parts of the world, to your point about low-income communities and remittances and war-torn nations and in hyperinflationary currencies. If you didn't trust your bank, you'd be like, well, I need another record. So what happens with Bitcoin specifically is, rather than the intermediaries the banks talking to each other, what's happening is a network of computers. When I take over my crypto wallet and I send you some Bitcoin, it goes to your Bitcoin wallet, your crypto wallet, a network of computers all over the world are recording that simultaneously, that transaction. So you can imagine there's like 100 million computers, or whatever number right now, running that transaction. They're all recording the same thing, okay? So for you to come back and say, oh, you never paid me, you'd have to convince those networks, that that record was wrong. It's basically impossible, right? Now, we talk a lot about in Bitcoin, the reason Bitcoin is tamper-proof, the reason it's censorship-resistant is because you'd have to get 51% of that giant network to agree that the transaction was wrong. And it's just, again, not a viable thing to do. So it's energy intensive because all those computers are writing that record down, but you don't need a bank, you don't need you don't need nobody, and we can exchange that money directly. We call it peer-to-peer transactions.
Yeah.
I'm giving it directly to you. There's nobody in the middle. It's just a record that's happening, like an audience. If everyone out here wrote down, Sheila gives Malcolm $30, right?
Yeah.
You know more of these people than I do, so you could convince them.
Call them.
You could tell them what you could say.
Hey guys, $40.
Exactly. She never paid me, right?
Yeah,
that's right. But right, if they're all computers and they're anonymous to each other and to us, that you can imagine that wouldn't work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I just wonder just like how this is going to affect exchange rates, how it affects trade, those kinds of things.
It's a great question. So the reason that this is interesting is, what do banks do when you move money across the border? They take a fee.
Yeah.
Right? And for every bank you have to go through, they take a fee.
Yeah.
So I became very interested in this problem after the earthquake in Haiti. Okay, because getting money into Haiti it was so expensive to do that. You couldn't even do it to begin with, but you had to hop through, I think at the time it was like 6 banks, each of which took a fee. And it wound up being that if I wanted to send $10 over there, they got like 5, 6, something like that. It was a crazy haircut, okay? With crypto, there's no haircut. It's just instantly sent, it's instantly available, and there's none of this hopping that happens, none. Okay, so in an economy like the United States, for most people in the United States, the banking system works well enough. It's not great, okay, people don't love it, but it's efficient enough and it's secure enough. Increasingly in parts of the world, that's not true. And so this kind of exchange, especially cross borders, is very interesting. So to your point about trade, transfers, if you can do that and cut out all those fees, well, suddenly you have the ability to kind of micro-target things, right? To say, I not only want to give that organization money or that country, I want to give that individual money to do a thing with it.
Right, so it's almost like in church talk, we'd call it a restricted gift. And I want my money to go to the music department.
That's right. You could pinpoint target, right?
Yeah,
exactly right. Yeah. So things like that in the philanthropy space or in the relief space are really important.
That's what I was thinking. But, USAID. I was thinking about international development. You're exactly right. There doesn't have to be an intermediary, a middle person.
Correct. Right. And then all of the sort of grift and other things that sometimes happen in those spaces are not possible because it's all visible on this on this ledger. So everyone can see. And so if part of that is diverted, you can see it all. Right. Now, I think the other thing to note though is that some governments are using this. Some governments are using Bitcoin, Latin America in particular, parts of the African continent, but it has not caught on its scale, okay? It'll be curious to see as USAID breaks down completely, are there private philanthropists, for example, or are there other actors who will do this pinpoint targeting and who will step in and supplement that massive loss of capital remains to be seen, but the option exists now because of crypto.
Yeah, exactly. So you do have you can have a connection with people in a way that just didn't exist before. And I guess that's part of the difference between Internet 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 is, maybe 1.0 is being able to read something about somebody in Zimbabwe, and 2.0 may be able to communicate directly with that person. 3.0 may be able to share resources.
Share information, right? Yeah. And to get back to your question about content, it was never really worth it, or it was very complicated. I'm not sure it was worth it. It was very complicated to send someone a penny for every time you read an article. Are you really doing that? Like and then if someone was capturing that, how many pennies do you need for them to take their cut for it to be worth it?
Yeah.
Micropayments are something we are yet to start exploring. But this idea that if you're a journalist and you're making a living, but there's no, God forbid, no media company that can actually pay you for that service, right? You're paid by individuals. Well, right now, someone might pay, $20 for the Substack of a famous person, right? Because they want to be part of that and contribute to that person. But for someone starting out, it's very difficult. So micropayments, royalties, things like this, you can do at a fraction of a cent. You could track all of that using a blockchain and aggregate it into a wallet, and there's no intermediary taking a cut. Yeah. So you can imagine new economic models. If I controlled my data, and I said, I want this information to be used by a healthcare company to research let's say my genomic data, right? 23andMe is a great example of happening right now. Yeah. My information, I want that used for healthcare research purposes, but not for cosmetics purposes or whatever. I could make a decision like that, and I could do this for free. And this, I'd say, I'll get it to you if I get a cut back, right? And that's very trackable and manageable using crypto and a blockchain in ways that it wasn't before.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about just in these different sectors. I think about nature and the environment too. So, like, what kind of effect is I mean, we've all definitely heard the energy demands of blockchain technology, but what other ways is it affecting our experience of nature and the environment? Have you thought very much about that?
I have quite a bit, actually. I have, and I'll say one thing, which is the use of AI has blown Bitcoin out of the water.
I know.
Okay, so now, it's not laughable because it's its own challenge for sure. But I was at this conference called NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislators, last year in Kentucky in Louisville, and one of the number one topics was these data centers, and they're all about AI data centers. It wasn't Bitcoin anymore, Bitcoin mining. It was AI centers, and should they be underground, or what if they're noisy, or the heat they generate, or are they destroying our natural environment, or all of that? And these are very real questions because we might blithely use AI, but we're not always giving thought to what's the energy consumption behind that model. When we ask, Gemini or Perplexity or whoever it is, something, what's the energy cost? That's really a pretty divorced question. And because I think Bitcoin, there's a moral judgment about that. Like, do we need that new money, and who's it benefiting and all that? With AI, we don't really think about it because it's like a tool for humanity, right? Well, at what cost? So I think about this actually quite a bit. I think when it comes to blockchain, there's been some interesting work on every time there's a surge in interest in blockchain, carbon credits come up. Could you track carbon credits in a way where you couldn't cheat or lie, right, about your decarbonization efforts? You could do the blockchain for that, and you could kind of see, like, okay, here's the proof that you actually are engaging in those efforts, right?
Yeah, you promised to plant a tree in the Amazon, and here's your proof that the tree was planted.
You did it, proof of tree, right? So you could imagine things like that. I think there's also DNA collection actually is an interesting one because in the Amazon, there was a project to collect some of these, as the Amazon is being laid waste to, we're losing so many species. And the idea was, could we collect the species DNA? Could we do that on a blockchain so it's immutable, it can't be targeted, it can't be exploited, but it's kept and contained? And that was after concerns that there was a lab somewhere, I forget now where it was, that was destroyed essentially because of a natural disaster, and a lot of that information was just
lost.
It was coded and there was some ability, but really it was not kept in any meaningful way. And the encryption on it was not secure, all those kinds of things. All those are solved problems with the blockchain. Now, these are all downstream, okay? Because of course what you really want is not to have the Amazon being burned down. Like, that's what you really want. But to the extent that that is a problem that cannot be solved by technology, which I would argue it very much is, at least you can do preservation of that information in a way that is quite secure. But again, I don't want to mistake that solution. It's solving a different problem, not the original problem.
No, I just was curious, how you saw it affecting that sector. One of the things you mentioned was just how AI is changing in terms of like believability of things that we experience on the internet. I wonder if you can talk just about other changes that AI is making, and where do you think we're going with it? So at Christmas I preached a sermon saying like AI sermons are terrible. Like they just don't work yet. Maybe they'll one day will be wonderful, but they don't. So for me, what it's useful for is to say, hey, in Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics, what page is his discussion of Romans chapter 3 verses 8? That is helpful. But as a research, and then if it's wrong, I look at it. Oh, this is totally made up. There's no. So that's
check it.
Yeah, exactly. Because you look on page.
You look at it. That's right.
But it's a change in perception, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how AI is changing things for us.
Oh my goodness. Well, this is where I think you have to have a generational conversation. Okay. So if you were to talk to someone in our rough, age bracket, we have that sense of the uncanniness of things because we were trained and we were raised in a different environment with print, with whatever it was. So we have a sensibility we've formed. We have an instinct. Malcolm Gladwell's 20,000 hours, right? We've done that over and over again in terms of our content consumption. Has my 11-year-old done that? Is my 6-year-old going to do that? Like they're online. They're getting a lot of information there. Are they going to have the same ability to understand, that's AI generated this? So we say, it's not true, but it's not true. Is someone else going to know that? And as we go generation to generation, this is where I think you have to have that conversation. So we talk a lot about education and training children to use AI as an offensive tool, if you will, right? To do research and things like this. But what you have to have in parallel is that gut instinct around, does this feel right? Is this correct? Is this not? And so critical thinking is becoming even more essential and important of a skill, but also the ability to creatively generate content and to do creative writing and all of these things. So my husband often says, he's a longtime techie, he says storytelling will be the most important skill because AI will never be able to tell a story with the same human feel of a person, right? But other things, technical papers, legal, whatever it is, if you aren't trained in it, programming, you won't even know that it's not accurate. So I might look at, I'm a sufficient enough coder, I can look at things and audit basic code. I'm not going to have a clue. And you give sermons, so you're going to know if something feels right or not. I'm a lawyer. I'll know if it feels right or not. But if I were to come in, I wouldn't know. I would have no idea. Yeah. Even now, I'm not trained in that profession. So having that sensibility is going to be critically important, and having, again, these arbiters who are engaging to say, I don't know about that. But I think you can't have that conversation and really understand the concerns around it unless you think about it as a generational change and a generational question of inquiry.
Yeah. And it's, like I said, it's just, how I look at it when my son introduced me to it, like 3 years ago, it's just completely different.
Very different.
And obviously because I'm interacting with it in different ways.
Well, and that's the thing, the pace of change is so fast, right? So for me, going from Oregon Trail or Carmen San Diego or whatever, to having email was like a decade, right? But for kids now, like AI, ChatGPT 4 to 4.5, that was like months in the making, and the changes are so profound. So by the time they learn a thing, it's already outdated. So how are we even going to get to a place where just that sheer pace of change and how your neurology, your brain is going to adapt, and how you're going to wire yourself?
Just a sense of cynicism of why learn anything, because the AI is going to do it better than you before.
That's the dystopia. That's the worst case scenario, I think, right? That we just give up.
Right, completely. Yeah, it's such an interesting setting. My heart goes out to young people, because it is like such a massive amount of change all the time, and so little stability.
Well, we see it. The anxiety levels of young people are at an all-time high, right? And they're not getting better; they're getting worse. You have young adults who, to their great credit, are self-censoring, or saying too much time on the internet. Like, I can't be on this app. I need to set a timer. I need to monitor myself because it's addictive. It is designed to be addictive, like literally addictive. Not just social media, but other things as well, right? So, and then again, like, it's being so fine-tuned to each individual, not a statistic of what a young person at the age of whatever, 25 would want, but like that particular individual. It's very, very disturbing.
Yeah, it is. Last week we had Tom Steyer, was on the forum, and he was talking about just young people saying they didn't want to have children because things are going to be so bad in the future. And it was just, it was a sad conversation. It was just like a sense of despair about the future. And he wanted to be an optimist about, what things could be in the future. And my heart goes out to that effort, but the changes are so profound. I just think of the last 2 months, the changes that we've seen just in government. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that too, because there is a little bit of the fantasy of blockchain to like that it'd be free of government. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Well, tell me about it. So let me tell you about my story. So, I came in as somebody who really genuinely believes that there's a role for government regulation, for sure. I do think that I think there was a lack of awareness, and this is true of governments in many parts of the world, but particularly the United States, about how important these technologies are going to be, and kind of almost a denial, I would say, about how fast things are changing and the pace of change. And as someone who spent a lot of time in Washington, I understand why that is. Everybody has their own bubble. We're in the Silicon Valley kind of tech bubble over here. There's a political Washington bubble, all this kind of thing. And in some cases, I think when folks tried to regulate technologies, they got it a little off in ways that were actually problematic for their countries. So it's difficult to know, and we know that tech is always going to outpace regulation. Growth is always going to outpace regulation. Business is going to outpace regulation. That's kind of the nature of the beast. It's been that way for a very long time. But in tech, that pace of change is even more crazy. So we're in an environment now where in the United States, we don't have a lot of regulations, these technologies. I find that really, really problematic. I think it is a deep issue, a deep concern, and a big miss on the part of the government, the federal level. I think here in California, we're doing a little better, where at least we have awareness. We have more awareness because this is an economy that affects, it's our economy, it's a state economy, right? I think there are some states who are doing very groundbreaking work that are not necessarily tech capitals. Wyoming, I would cite, is one. New Hampshire has been paying a lot of attention to technologies. So it is possible to do this, right? But without, and I don't think of regulation as a depressant on growth. I actually think that regulation is, it's helping shape the environment in ways that are quite profound. And it doesn't have to pull back and hold reins back. It's basically saying there are ways of doing this that are not about creating the next generation of those handful of companies that are able to be in a position where they are exploiting people, which is really what's happening, right? I mean, we talk about digital serfdom a lot, the idea that we are in service of feudalism in our digital spaces, and we all feel that, and when I say that, it never surprises anybody, we feel it instinctively. It's true. Do we want that to carry forward and continue? I would say no. And so it's not just an antitrust question for me, and I came down to a place, after 3 years of trying to get there with government, trying to get there with regulation, trying to say, there are ways of of being thoughtful about the people who are doing this with good faith and those who are out to scam people. And there's a lot of that in crypto. There's a lot of scamming happening in crypto. I want to be very, very upfront about that. How do you differentiate? There really isn't a way, okay? It's difficult. And again, I have a gut instinct because I've been doing this 20,000 hours, but most people can't tell the difference. So without that, how do you do it? And for me, what I finally realized was you got to shape the path. So rather than trying to come in at the top level and say, we're not going to let these companies combine, or we're not going to let this company do this thing, or whatever, you come in and you basically say the entire architecture of the internet needs to change. Okay, so I think about this.
Because that's where you can change.
That's where you can change
Google's not going to change it.
That's right. That's where you can change it. You could come in at that level and say, now it's really hard to build exploitative models, right? It's or more difficult anyway, right? That to me seems like the best.
But in a way, that's just exactly the problem. I mean, there's like our distrust with government, like the massive cuts of government employees. Like, has that been disheartening for you in thinking that it may not be possible for government to be able to solve these problems?
You know, I try to to avoid falling into despair about certain things. You know, so I've done a lot of work in my career in global development. I've done work in education. I've done work with labor. You know, so I try to kind of take from those movements and community building in those movements, and the fact that they still get up every single day and they do the work. You know, and in these cases, the funding directly affects: can they open a lab? Can they feed people? Can they build a well? Can they vaccinate children? Like all of these critical, I would argue, mission critical things to being humans on the planet Earth. You know, they're getting up every day, and I take a lot of inspiration from folks like that. But I also think things were heading for a break. Things were heading towards a break anyway. You could call it a breakdown, but you just call it a break, right? And you're right, trust is eroding all over the place in institutions. It's not just government. It was also including, by the way, these big tech companies. I don't think people trust them. They just go there because it's a tool that kind of gives them some comfort, right? And for other, they make their money there, whatever it is. So this is accelerating that. And how do I feel about that? Well, you know, we're going to have to see what comes out of that. But I think it was inevitable. That's kind of my current thinking. And we've seen it, some of us, I think you included, have seen this happening for some time as faith in institutions starts to erode. And so it gives us a chance to build out of that. And the question is, what comes next? Because the pace of the crumbling is also massively happening at massive scale in ways I saw a lot of this coming because I was in a Washington-oriented job the last 3 years, but didn't see this pace of change coming. And so it's an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity. And I think the problem is the damage, the collateral damage that's going to happen in that breaking is going to fall disproportionately on people who are poor, people who are don't have power, don't have privilege, right? As it always does. And that is heartbreaking to bear witness to. And I don't want to in any way diminish that, but I also think we have to be thinking to what comes next, right? And supporting the people who are working to help those who are being hit by this time, right? Who are being most directly hurt by what's happening right now.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the traditions we have on the forum is we take questions, written questions from people. I forgot to tell you that. Sorry about that. So we take written questions, and then I read the questions.
Okay.
You know, one of the big things that we haven't talked about yet, but I'm really interested in hearing your take on it, is privacy and privacy issues. And maybe you can talk about privacy like over the last 30 years, and then, you know, what are these technological changes in the future are leading us to in terms of privacy?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. So I am a big privacy advocate. I think privacy is critically important, and I tend to look at the sort of narrower use case. And I think a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, why do I need my information private? I have nothing to hide, right?" Well, you're not maybe the use case, right? I think a lot about activists. I think a lot about people in open revolution and rebellion. I think about people who are exercising their First Amendment right to speech. I think about a lot of these kinds of contexts in which people have every right to not have their private lives spewed all over the internet or the press or wherever else it is, you know? And I think a lot of people come to this work.
By the same token, we shouldn't have to live in a way that we feel like we're going to be exposed, and
that's right.
So it changes how we behave.
Yeah, I think that's right. Right. If you're constantly aware of being surveilled, they did a study in London. London's the most, at least at the time of the study, it was the most surveilled city in the world.
Right,
okay,
cameras.
And they did this study about people who knew that and people who didn't know that, and kind of the differences and how they even walked down the street, like just the awareness. And some would say, "Oh, well, they should be, you know, acting kindly and or whatever it is, whatever the differences were, right? And being more polite to people or whatever. But like, is that why you want that happening?
So the people who are aware of the CCTV cameras were more polite?
Well, sometimes they're more stressed out, and so it led to more like paranoia, So it can go one way or the other depending on who you are. Yeah. But there was noticeable change in behavior if you knew you were being surveilled versus if you didn't know. Okay, which is very just the way you sit, the way you all of that, right? So all those things I think are very observable phenomenon. And to me, privacy has become so much more than, I'm doing a search I don't want anyone to know about because I'm embarrassed about it. It's become like I'm literally walking down the street and I'm having a conversation that I think is private, but like it's being picked up by cameras all over me and they can hear what I'm saying, right? And so in the law, we talk a lot about privacy, and the idea is if you're outside of your home, there's a big distinction between inside your home and outside your home. Outside your home, no expectation of privacy. At any moment, someone could fly a drone over, and you just have to kind of accept that lack of privacy. If it were that private, take it inside your car, inside your house. Don't do the thing in public. It's kind of like the general default setting for the law. That's not even true anymore inside your own home, right? Yeah. There was this crazy story I saw of this woman who is, and she was recording something like a TikTok or something like that, and this drone comes up behind her in the window, and she caught it on camera, and she's like, "What? What's going on?" It's like, that's crazy. Yeah. So things like that are that's a very egregious example, but like there are all of these ways in which our devices, like forget the drone in the window.
Yeah, that little Amazon voice.
You have that Dot, you have that Google, it's all in your house recording everything you're saying. And people don't think about it because they're like, oh, but it will tell me how many eggs I need to put into this recipe. And you're like, well, the trade-off there is kind of, So all these things, I think, is there privacy in your home when you are willingly putting a device owned by a tech company in your home and talking in front of it with full candor?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, well, I also people talk to me about a lot of things that I don't think they want to share with other people. And
I expect that's true.
That is just really important that is. It's funny because I was thinking of privacy even further back. In the 19th century, we treated people's written journals in a very special way in terms of its admissibility in court,
right.
The ability of authorities to be able to take those from you. And there was a private place where someone could tell you about a horrible thing that they'd done, and you could hold that. And I worry about that for the future.
How do you have an interior life when everything is exterior, right? And so many things are, and there's financial and other benefit from being performative. So how do you even think about your interior life versus your performative, the way you perform in the world, when there is such a trade-off to that that's very visceral and very clear? It's a difficult question, but then where you are very clear on what should be private, how do you preserve that? I think it's a very important question. It's why I think privacy is at the center of all of this. But if you don't control your own data online, the idea you have any privacy is pretty silly. It follows. It's hard to follow. It's hard to go the other way. If you start with the premise that everything is yours, then you can make a meaningful decision about what is private and what is not. Right? We don't really have that default setting online right now in ways that people don't really understand. Because yes, it's not that I'm sharing it with the world, meaning anybody who goes to TikTok can see whatever apart from what you post, but TikTok can see it. Meta can see it.
Well, I'm thinking
Google
about like Google
right?
Drive.
Google
so
Drive.
all your files.
Online journals or keep that journal on a Google Doc. Really, is that that might feel? I don't know. You might want to be pen and paper is always a good way.
So
for sure.
Yeah, there's the old technologies. There's things that the benefits.
Papyrus, Malcolm. The answer is papyrus. That's the answer.
Here's a great question: are religious faith and technology totally separate spheres? Is there any room for convergence? So I did have questions about that. That's a good one. Thank you.
Excellent question. Do you want to go one at a time?
Yeah, no, I would love to hear your take.
I would love to hear your take on this too.
Yeah.
It's a great question.
I think that this is the old story that everybody is here is so sick of me telling. But when Gutenberg started publishing Bibles, it was an incredibly a huge change, a huge technological change. So Europe didn't have typeset printing before that, and the Bibles were great. But that was also correlated with like international witch hunts. So literally you could here's a picture of a witch and here are the 7 things to worry about in a witch. It was like, and so you could have witch hunting in New England, you could have it in Czechoslovakia, you could have it everywhere that was affected by the European universe. And so that to me is just like like the beauty, like you can communicate a religious text that was not accessible to people. You could print it in the language that they understood. That is an extraordinary thing, but it has this other darker side too.
Yeah, well, I've been reading a lot about World War II resistance and also about labor movements, particularly in California during post-Depression, when people from Oklahoma or other places were moving here, right, and they were trying to organize, and it's early days of this, and the most important thing was having a printing press. Being able to basically create at-scale copies of leaflets or information, or we're meeting at this time, or whatever it was, and having scale of that, having hundreds of them, not the one in the drugstore that could be pulled down, was critically important, right? So as a tool of resistance, we don't think about print as a technology, but it's super critical and important. But to the question about faith, I mean, I think that they are inextricably linked. Our belief in humanity, I think, is either going to be undermined by technology or it's going to be reinforced by technology. And to me, I feel like our fundamental humanity is something that technology is not actually compromising at its core. It's compromising it on all the edges, for sure. And I think it's compromising on its face, if that makes sense. But at the heart of things, and deep inside people's soul or in their heart, or however you want to frame this, depending on your traditions, I think there is something that is intact there that is not going to be corrupted by all of this. And that's why I come out as an optimist. I say this breaking that's happening, this unraveling that's happening, that whatever term you want to use, it's happening at a pace. I feel optimistic that we will come through it because our core humanity is not threatened by this application and this interpretation of humanity that comes from AI, because that's what it is, it's an interpretation of humanity, right? It's not humanity itself. And I think that's very much a matter of faith. And so to me, whether that's religious faith or whether it's faith in humanity or faith in the universe or faith in science or math or whatever you want to have faith in, to me, if you have that perspective, I think you're going to feel more optimistic about the time we're in than if you do not have that kind of faith. So I would say they are inextricably interlinked, and the way you feel about technology and advances is going to be related, I think, at some core level to how much faith you have in humanity.
Yeah, I think it's very important to have areas of life that are not influenced by technology. In other words, it's important to just spend time out in the natural world.
Walking in nature.
It's time in prayer, time in worship. Those are really important for our humanity. And I think too, when you describe like being like all of us serfs to the the greater computer overlords. I mean, if you think that every time you're on that device, every time you're typing on, every time you're writing, it's almost like we're all making a contribution to this one great thing, this like the internet thing. But there's so much more to life beyond that.
There's so much more than that. That's so much more than that. Can I tell you about what's giving me a lot of joy right
Yeah,
now? Speaking of intersections,
definitely.
so this is very funny. So there's this device called a Bird Buddy, okay? And what it is it's a bird feeder with a camera in the back that's solar powered. And so every time a bird comes to the feeder, you get these gorgeous pictures of them looking at the camera. It's an amazing shot of these birds. And so we have this up in our house. And all these birds come every single day. And at the end of the day, you get a roundup of the snapshot of these little birds.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, oh, what a beautiful use of technology. And AI identifies what species it is, what the bird is. It's the same bird. You can name the bird. It just gives you this connection to the natural world that I'm like, wow, what an amazing use of technology, right? And it's using solar panels, it's using a camera, it's using Wi-Fi, it's using all of these things, it's using AI, but it's joyful, right? And it can be that way.
Yeah, Henry David Thoreau used to, when he used to walk in the woods in Concord, he'd carry this huge book.
That's right.
So he could identify the plants that he saw.
Right, the plants.
So there are, and I love people who are like taking on projects that humanize us, you know, and I do see so much of that. Okay, here's another question. Can you comment on Musk, I think's project to implant computer chips on human brains? Are we all going to be robots? And it is. It's his company that does those implants.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So Neuralink, all of these things, right? This is about like, what's the ultimate data source? It's your thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay. So right now, part of how we preserve our humanity is we think things in our mind that do not manifest. So if you talk about garage door openers, you get this thing. But if you think about garage door openers, at least so far, you don't get the ad. Okay. You don't get the ad. So if there's a chip in your brain recording what you're thinking, maybe you get the ad. So I am not generally a fan of cybernetic type engagements. However, I think it starts where it often starts, which is medical. Okay, so you say, okay, but if you're somebody who has speech concerns, or you have
you're paralyzed on the side of your body,
you have you have like very micro hormone regulation you have to do. This can be extremely, extremely useful and important, right? And so there, it's like where you draw the line. Where are you kind of correcting something that is causing pain or causing problems or causing strife, and where are you enhancing. And the reason why this particular example concerns me greatly is because I think we're at what point are we in just straight up eugenics? Yeah. At what point are we like designer babies, designer brain, designer life, for whatever we're optimizing for? And who is designing that life? Yeah. Are there women in these studies? Are there people of color in these studies? Yeah. Are there people who is deciding what
Elon
the frame
Musk.
should be? Well, exactly right. So unless I think if you are eager to be Elon Musk, this is a great development. If you're perhaps eager to be something else, maybe this is not the way we want to go. So I say it with some caveat because I think that I don't want to discount the importances for things like medical research and medical technology and advancement there, but I think these slopes are quite slippery, more than we realize. And next thing you know, your garage door opener thought is,
Yeah.
everywhere you go.
Well, then I'm the person who gave the question is a lawyer, so I can imagine, having an implant and passing the bar in all 50 states. It was really easy
there it is.
For you.
So easy.
Yeah,
right?
so
Just
easy.
got the information right there.
Yeah.
It's a far cry from your note card you took in, right, to your test for sure.
But I guess that's part of it with all these technologies that just we can't even conceive of.
We can't even imagine it. Yeah. And I think there's a humility we have to have about this stuff, right? And I would say this in government all the time. I would say we have to be humble because you're imagining the world the way we're all imagining the world the way we know it to be. And so again, the Web 1.0, what was it? It was just taking content and moving it online. It was very direct porting, and you'd read a thing, and it was like taking the thing that was printed and putting it it was very static. Who on earth would have thought? And that was like the 90s. Yeah. It wasn't like 1890, it was 1990, right? Yeah. As my children would say, in the 1900s, right? So it wasn't that long ago, though. And so the reality there is how we can't even imagine the pace. We can't even imagine the pace. So if we were to put a chip in our brain, next thing we know, that would be scanning for who knows what.
Yeah, right.
It would be, I literally can't even imagine.
They would just scan their faces and tell me what their names were and what their income was.
Maybe we'd be a world of silence. You wouldn't know what anyone's voice sounded like because we'd all just communicate in our brains. I have no idea what would emerge from this, right? How would you enjoy music? How would you, all of these things, I think sometimes silence might be nice.
I like what you said about humility. I just was thinking about I just don't see our leaders as being people of humility. and maybe I'm completely wrong about it,
That was a spin take, so it was a very bad time to take.
Sorry.
That's totally fine.
But I think that's one of the things I'm going to take away for our day today is just that humility is a really important part of your humanity. Yes. And being able to make mistakes and own up to those mistakes and apologize for those mistakes. Yes. And not feeling like we always have to just project the sensibility that we know everything or have all the answers.
To me, you can't be authentic if you aren't starting from a place of being humble.
Yeah.
Because authenticity means that you don't know a lot of things, right? You don't know them. And not because you aren't capable of knowing them, which some people take it as I just haven't studied that yet. Well, okay, but you haven't, and so you don't know it, And I do think one of the things I worry about with AI is the armchair experts. One of the big jokes that goes around as memes is especially on X, on Elon's Twitter, is this, we're going to see everyone on crypto Twitter going from being a trade expert, to being a global development expert, overnight, because people have this sense that if they can Google something or they can search something up or they can get ChatGPT to write it for them, they somehow know it. And I think that that to me fundamentally is about a lack of humility. Yeah. It's this idea, it's this fear of not knowing and somehow feeling that is marking you as less than someone else in some weird hierarchy that no one's actually paying attention to in the first place. But it's also, it's scary because if you really believe that you are the center of knowledge and the center of expertise on every single topic or are capable of being so, which is not true of anybody, then what does that mean for anybody else? Right? So I think to me, we talk more about authenticity than humility, but to me, they go, one's a predicate for the other. You can't be authentic if you're not humble because being authentic means acknowledging your limitations, which all of us have, and being very comfortable with those limitations and knowing when to ask for help or for support.
Well, it sure gives me a different idea of what knowing everything could be. Do you know what I mean? And back to that religion question.
Yeah, definitely.
In this time of revisionist history and removal of content, how could blockchain technology be used to reconstruct this lost information?
Oh, what an amazing question.
I know, it's a great question.
I have the privilege of being an advisor and on the board of an organization called the Filecoin Foundation. And what Filecoin does is it uses something, great name, wait for it, IPFS, Interplanetary File System, okay? And what that is essentially a way way of securing information and storing data on a ledger. So back in college, and this, I say I wasn't a techie, but I was kind of a techie because I actually did SETI at home. Might remember this. So SETI at home was out of MIT, I believe. Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And what it allowed you to do was when your big, gigantic, desktop computer, when I was just like typing on it, or when I wasn't using it, you could use that compute, right, to look for to be like, is there alien life, and to kind of run these algorithms on the back end. So similarly to that, most of our devices, our phones, our laptops, or whatever it is, even our home devices, they have a lot of compute, a lot of stuff. They're not using any of that, a lot of data storage. So how do you share that and create distribution of this information? So the Internet Archive, which if you're not familiar with, you should be. They're in town. They have lunches regularly. They're amazing. Incredible people come there. They went on they have been for a generation, I would say. They have actually been collecting information online on the internet and saying we have to store all of this. Librarians are doing this. So the second that it was clear, where things were going politically, these folks were out there just archiving everything, and in many cases recording it on either a Filecoin or one of their or a similar kind of structure, so that it's tamper-proof. Nobody can come in and demand you destroy the laptop. You're like smashing that. That doesn't matter on a blockchain because there's so many of them. 50 million of them, exactly, right? Like all of them. So they've started doing this, and I think it's critically important work. And there's actually training of librarians on how to record things on a blockchain that are sensitive or that are potentially threatening, to whatever regime might be in place in any place in time. This was happening. They did this to record before USC, before the big fires. They were moving a lot of the archival footage of Holocaust survivors on chain. That was a huge project that USC was doing actually with Filecoin to say all of this is such critically important testimony and stories and all of that. It's preserved, and it's preserved forever. Right? So I think it's one of the most important uses of blockchain right now, sad to say, is preservation of information, preservation of testimony, of evidence. During the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, there were people on the ground recording onto blockchain the evidence of atrocity. So when the time comes for a trial, which, assuming that the time comes for a trial, there will be evidence. And not unlike in Nuremberg, where you kind of are relying on witness firsthand testimony, it's tamper-proof testimony. So it will ease a lot of the requirements at the ICC around how do you prove these atrocities happened and hold people accountable for them. So this kind of thing is happening in real time. I think it's some of the most important work, actually, and so I'm so glad for the question.
It was a great question, a great answer. I'm so glad. I just don't know how many people I know who I could ask that question.
Well, here I am.
Here we are. Oh my gosh, I can't believe our time has just gone by so quickly, Sheila. It's just such a pleasure to have you here this morning. Please join us next Sunday when our guest will be Dr. Yuria Silidwin, a scholar of indigenous traditions and the ethics of belonging. You're welcome to join us upstairs for the Choral Eucharist at 11 o'clock. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. And thanks again, Sheila Warren. We're so blessed to have you here today. And thanks for your work out there in the world and trying to make it a more humane place.
Well, thank you for the time today and for the attention. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure thing.